Alrighty, I'm gonna just sleep in anyway because things are weird. I've never seen it do that before. That's fine. Anyway, so I'm on part, this will be part 3 tonight. Oh, it's 4. Sorry, part 4. And I'll be reading only 5 chapters because I'm running super late. Sorry about that, guys. And starting off with chapter 17. For those of you just tuning in, I am currently reading one of my dad's manuscripts. It's a fantasy adventure. This one is called the Wolf Talisman, and I'm not sure if it's part of a series. I can't really tell. I think it might be though. They seem kind of related, but I'm kind of getting a feeling like it might be. It might be a precursor to the other two, which would be Talisman of the Winds and, pardon me, and also Stonecaller. So if you haven't read either of those, then go back. You can go back to my past broadcasts and watch those. Otherwise, I'll take up where I left off last night. Chapter 17. Several days later, on the border between Queosach and Helidania. He had begun to suspect something like this, and when they actually reached the mountains, he was fairly sure of it. At first, Dalwyn thought they might be taking him far enough out to the wilds that word of his murder might not get back to his people. But eventually, they'd gone even further than was necessary for that. So the next alternative was to deliver him to the Queosach. There had been rumors of Dalum disposing of inconvenient persons by giving them to the Queosach, but up till now, it had been nothing more than rumors. But now, here he was, riding in a cage into the Queosach town, accompanied by servants of Prince Dalum. Nor was it just any Queosach town. This one had a palisade about it, and a large hall, larger than any of the other log huts in town, dominating the center. This must be the town of a particularly powerful chief. Before they had come into Queosach territory, the Helidanians had cut green branches and tied them to their helmets and saddles, and with a few tied to the cage for good measure. This sign of peace had apparently been accepted by the Queosach, for they had no difficulty getting here. They had seen 1 or 2 people working the fields on their way, but these had apparently paid them little attention. When they had come nearer the town, however, it was a different matter. The large blond Queosach men and husky women halted what they were doing to stare at the travelers, and children and dogs ran along beside the cart for a ways, chattering to each other and addressing comments and questions to the Helidanians. Nisag came riding to the cart and spoke to Dalwyn. "This is as far as we take you, Arnalan. You'll belong to Lathiat Afagar for now, and you can run away from him if you like. Just a little word of warning, though. Escaped slaves are usually skinned alive. Keep that in mind while you make your plans for running off." In fact, some part of Dalwyn's mind was considering that, once he was out of his cage, escape might be well more possible. Another part of his mind, whether it would be worth the bother. A large man wearing a gold ring on his arm came out of the central hall. The cart pulled up to a stop in front of him, and he looked at the prisoner. The Queosach was tall, muscular, with a broad face and covered by a thick beard. The beard showed little traces of white, but this man was obviously still full of vigor. He looked at Dalwyn while speaking to Nisag. "So your prince sends me another one of his undesirables? This one doesn't look like much, does he?" "Well, there's a shed out behind the hall. Take him there and have them lock him in. I'll talk to him in a day or 2. He spoke the language of Helidania with a heavy accent, and occasionally used Queosach words where the Helidanian word was not ready to his tongue. Nisag acknowledged the order. and brought the cart creaking round to the back of the hall. Despite his talk of Dalwyn being a problem for the Queosach now, Nisag was very careful to see to it that he was unloaded and put in the shed with no opportunity to try to escape. The door of the shed was barred behind him, and Dalwyn was left alone. The inside of the shed was dim, though a little light coming in through the chinks in the log walls prevented it from being absolutely dark. It smelled of some prior occupant or occupants, and there was a pile of straw in one corner to serve as a bed. A little later in the afternoon, the door was opened. One man was standing there with a spear at the ready in case he should try to rush the door. The other man tossed in a loaf of hard bread and a skin of water, said something in Queosach, then the door closed once more. He spent a while surveying his prison. It was solidly built of notched logs and floored with poles with their ends anchored under the walls. The roof was slanted, covered over with withes bound to the rafters, and a layer of thatch over that. It might be possible to break one's way through that roof, but Dalwyn held himself back from making an immediate attempt. The Queosach were not fools, and they would most certainly have someone watching for just that. Night fell, he slept, and woke again in the morning with the light of dawn coming in through in the chinks. He heard the sounds of Queosach town coming alive, people chopping wood, washing clothes, and eventually smithies going to work as well. Out of curiosity, he tried to count the numbers of smiths by the direction and sounds of the overlapping pounding. His conclusion was that there must be at least 5, possibly more. No one seemed to bother about the shed or the prisoner. Finally, late in the afternoon, the door opened once more. Just as the previous day, there was a spearman, and a man carrying a water skin and a loaf of bread. He tossed them in, said something that sounded like the same thing he'd said yesterday, closed the door, and barred it again. He considered what might be the point of this. He thought it was likely they were trying to beat down his spirit, treating him like an animal. After this had gone on for a while, when someone actually seemed to take notice of him, he should feel at least some desire to please him. They were trying to train him, like a beast. That turned his thought to his talisman, and he put his mind to it. After a moment of straining, he managed to change his shape, but he found it difficult to hold the wolf shape. He returned to his human shape and rested. He was not as bad as he had been before, when he could not change shape at all. This caused him to realize something else. His state of mind had changed from when he had been on the trail from Incro. He'd been trying to make plans for his escape, but he could not seem to keep his mind on those plans. He kept telling himself to watch for an opportunity. Now he's thinking more along the lines of making his own opportunity. What was causing this difference? He was wondering if Nisag had been putting something in the food or drink he'd provided that kept him tractable. Entirely too possible. He turned his mind back to the present. He could see little of the outside. Even by pressing his face to the chinks in the logs, it occurred to him that this prison was arranged to be difficult to escape from, but not impossible. He could even see a possible reason for that. A prisoner would attempt to escape, perhaps 2 or 3 times, each time be caught before getting very far at all. He would probably then be beaten and tossed back into the shed. Each failed escape would teach him again that there was no escape, so eventually he would no longer bother to try. Suppose he refused to play that game. Suppose he played an entirely different game, that of the totally subdued prisoner, and played it again until they began to grow careless. He leaned back against the wall and smiled. Another night and another day passed, and each time, at one point in the afternoon, his food and water were delivered. This afternoon they also collected the empty water skins. The spearman motioned him back toward the far wall while the other came in, picked up the water skins, and went out. The spearman backed out cautiously after that. The next day, in the middle of the afternoon, the door was open, and Telwathiet Afagar entered. King of the Queosach was alone, carrying a stick about the length of his arm and about 3 fingers thick. He spoke in his heavily accented Hellenanian. "You are mine now to do with as I wish. The first thing I wish to do is to teach you who is master here." He struck out with his stick so quickly that Dalwyn didn't see it coming, and it caught him across the side of the head. It was not a heavy blow, nowhere near so strong as that of a man such a build could deliver, but it stunned Dalwyn and dropped him to the floor. Talwathiet stepped forward and brought the stick down again, this time across the Dalwyn's back. Up went the stick and down it came, again and again. Somewhere in the midst of the beating, Dalwyn shifted his shape. It was almost an unconscious decision. The first blow had dazed him, and the succeeding blows had prevented him from gaining full control of his mind, but something told him he had to do something. The shape change, as it so often had before, washed away most of the pain, cleared his head almost completely. He rolled away and came to 4 feet. Suddenly, the king of the Queosach realized he was raising a stick to strike a large grey wolf. He hesitated for an instant, and in that instant Dalwyn sprang. Talwathiet was a quick man, for all his side, and he almost managed to get the stick between himself and Dalwyn. Despite that, he staggered back a step when Dalwyn's weight hit him, leaving a small opening. Dalwyn tore his throat out. He whirled around toward the door immediately. The king had left the door open, part of his ignorance. Did his arrogance extend to coming out unaccompanied on this occasion? There was no time to waste on careful reconnaissance. His greatest advantage was surprise. He leapt out the door. No one was around. Reminding himself of the route the cart had taken a few days ago, he dashed around the side of the great hall. He heard a shout, but did not stop to see where it had come from. He was off down the street, leading to the main gate, which he could see was wide open. This far into their home territory, it was likely that the Queosach very seldom closed the gate. There was more shouting, and some strange feeling made him jump a little to his left. A spear dug into the ground in the hardened earth of the street beside him. A man appeared beside the gate, shouting. Dalwyn kept running. The man threw his spear, a hasty cast which went wide by a foot or so. Then Dalwyn was springing at him. The man dodged aside and fell. Dalwyn continued out the gate, ignoring him. There was a good deal of shouting behind him now, and though his wolf shape could outrun any man of over a short distance, he knew that he would have to find cover if he was to elude them for any amount of time. And when they discovered the remains of their king, if they had not already done so, then the hunt might either become more serious or drop off altogether, depending on how they took the news. He headed across the fields toward the forest beyond. There were people working in the fields, but they were not armed, and so were of little concern to him. Some of them looked up at the sound of the outcry behind him, and even a few ran to try to head him off, brandishing their tools. Again, there was no way they could catch him before he got to the forest, and once he got in among the trees and underbrush, it would be a matter of avoiding the hunters, using all his wolf abilities and wolf senses. A stone flew past him, making him realize that there were other things than spears or arrows which could hurt him. He dodged this way and that. Then he reached the edge of the forest, slipping in among the bushes where he stopped for a rest. He considered for a moment. There was still shouting from the direction of the town, and people were coming this way. He would not let due overconfidence in his abilities lead him to disaster. He moved off again at a trot. His first goal would be to elude the hunt, no matter what. When that was done, he would begin moving towards Helidania and home. The hunters proved to be determined. He wondered if they had discovered their king and were intent on revenge, or if they merely had seen a wolf coming out of their town and were determined that any wolf who would actually enter a town was too dangerous to be allowed to live. Whichever was the case, he eventually eluded them. He crossed streams, backtracked, sought out harder ground so as to leave no trail, and eventually by sundown he was fairly confident he had lost them. For a while he simply reveled in his wolf senses and wolf feelings, the feeling of freedom being heightened by the comparison to the captivity of the last weeks. He hunted and caught a rabbit, drank from a stream, and then did some thinking as to what he would do next. He had lost the hunters for now, but there was a good chance that at least some of the Queosach, when they discovered what had happened to their king, would hunt him more intensively. He walked to the middle of the stream, then changed his shape again. He walked down the stream for a while, then stepped out, trying to leave as little track as possible. It might take them a little longer to connect wolf tracks entering the stream with human tracks coming out a little further on. Chapter 18. Haltod paced his chambers and considered. There were persistent rumors. which he could hardly believe, that his daughter had been taken refuge among the Makar. This was unlikely in the extreme. Even if she thought she needed to take refuge, would she go to those furry beasts for protection? And yet the rumors persisted, and his agents insisted that this was the most reliable news they could get. It was time, and well beyond time, he should gather his men and go into Makar territory and settle matters once and for all. The word from his officers was that the local recruits could be depended on for fighting against any external enemy, but to set them against their own people would risk various sorts of trouble, perhaps including mutiny. This made Haltod wonder just how reliable these troops would be. Even as garrison troops for Imcro, while Ataskan troops carried out the actual campaign, would they think deeply enough to see that merely holding down the garrison towns, they were freeing Ataskan troops to actually fight their countrymen? And even if only a few realized this, would they not convince their fellow soldiers? At the very least, the local troops could not be completely trusted. Well, he had sent a message to Prince Dalam and to the commander of the Ataskan troops serving the prince. At least half the troops to be returned to Haltod's command in Imcro, or to be returned to Haltod's command in Imcro. And if there were no definite evidence of Luron Intragon being alive, he should send back all of them. Haltod was a little irked about that as well. His agents, insofar as they could operate at all in Haladania proper, could find no sign of Prince Dalam's rival. It was almost certain that he had died in battle, though his body had never been recovered. This fact brought to Haltod's mind a suspicion. What if Dalam had specifically commanded his commanders that his brother's body, if found, should be disposed of secretly to allow the prince to hold on to Ataskan troops for a longer time? Of course, the prince would have to balance the advantage of this against the disadvantage of allowing any disgruntled chieftain for the next 20 years to claim that he was rising in the name of the rightful prince, who was keeping himself in hiding until he could be sure of sufficient support. And once the present king were overthrown, there would be a time of confusion in which the victorious chieftain could then assert his claim to the high kingship. But according to his agents, Dalam had made good use of the Ataskan troops to punish chieftains who had not supported him from the beginning. Attempts to track down and eliminate Prince Loren had only been tentative. Well, the prince would have to get along without his Ataskan troops in the near future, particularly in light of the word that the ex-count's companion, Wallen, had apparently crept back into Imcro and was attempting to incite rebellion. The rumor had it he had also taken refuge among the Makar, and that was another reason for dealing with the Makar as soon as possible. Yes, Dalam was going to have to get along without his Ataskan troops. Chapter 19. A week later, at Throdhe in Haladania. Prince Dalam frowned at the messenger. "This is the whole of your message?" "Yes, lord." "Repeat it for me one more time." Without hesitation, the messenger spoke. "My lord, the Lord Haltod, governor of Imcro, sends you greetings. He regrets that he must request the return of his troops he has lent you. If it pleases you, would you see to it that they are on their way within a week of this message?" The prince's frown grew deeper, so that the messenger felt a little fear. As a messenger from an official of the Ataskan Empire, even the most arrogant of rulers would hesitate before doing him serious harm. But anyone, particularly even the Prince of Haladania, might do something rash in the heat of anger. And though he might pay an indemnity later on, it would be too late for the unfortunate victim himself. But the prince nodded. "So be it. My servants will see to your comfort. I shall have a message to send and return to your lord within 3 days." The messenger, carefully showing no sign of his intense relief, bowed and went out. The prince sat there looking at the spot where the messenger had stood. So, Haltod wanted his troops back, did he? Well, it was true that there had been no sign of Loron in any of the realm, not even rumors. There were not even rumors of his taking refuge in the Empire, or fleeing to the Queosach, of all of which suggested he had died, and his body had not been recovered. And if that were the only reason for keeping the Ataskan troops, fair enough. But he knew very well that there was some disquiet among his people regarding the fact that he brought in foreigners to fight for him. He had done his best to deal with the major dissenters, but he could name at least 3 chieftains who, in the absence of the Ataskans, might well try their hand at unseating him. On the other hand, he had done his best to see to it that people who supported him were rewarded. There were a large number of chieftains whose fortunes were bound up with his, people who knew that his overthrow would mean difficulties for them, perhaps even death. The question of which must be asked was this: were there enough such people in the land to give him the upper hand if some sort of civil war should break out? With 1 more month he might be able to eliminate some of the dissenting chieftains in such a way as to overawe a few more waverers into the casting their support to him. The thing was, how best to arrange to keep the Ataskan soldiers for a little while longer while seeming to obey the request of the governor of Imcro. The best response is probably no response at all. Or, rather, to send the messenger back to tell Haltod that the troops would be on their way shortly, then to continue to use the troops as before. If, after 3 weeks, it seemed feasible to send back the troops, well and good. If not, ignore the situation until Haltod sent a further message. When that message came in, then see what the situation was once more. At a certain point, Haltod would send orders, probably in secret, to the commander of the force, ordering them to march to Imcro with or without the approval of the prince. By that time, it was hoped Halidania would be sufficiently under his control that he could do without the Ataskans. His brow furrowed again. What would be the response among his people if it seemed that the Ataskan troops were being jerked out from under him? Perhaps it would be best to arrange matters so that he sent them home himself, having no further need of their services. Yes, that would be best. He would keep them for a little while, then have a very public gathering, at which he expresses his thanks to the commander and his troops, then sends them on their way. And that would require careful planning, to keep them as long as possible and arrange to send them off just before the final message could arrive. The next thing to do was to decide just how best to use the Ataskan troops. There were still too many possibly dangerous people out there, including some who had sworn their oaths to him. He could not depend on dealing with more than 2 or 3 before he would have to send back the Ataskan troops. The question was, who was the biggest danger? A little while later, in the country of the Makar, she felt grim. She pretended otherwise. One of the many lessons her father had drummed into her was proving useful. No one, he would say, will want a wife who falls to pieces at the least little trouble. Whatever happens, you must continue to act as though this were no more than a passing difficulty. It began with the fact that the Makar people did not trust her completely, even though Ludasani had agreed with her advice and was willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. But word had made its way back to her father, that her father had a fair idea of where she was, and seemed to be waiting only to gather his forces before he moved on them. Then Walden had appeared among them, with a few close comrades. They travelled up into Halidania proper, almost all the way to Thrade, before they'd become certain that the iron cage with Dolwyn in it had not come that way. They had come back, and by careful questions had discovered that the cart had gone off to the east, and there was little likelihood of catching up to them by this time. Even if they did overtake them, it would probably be too late. So, assuming the Count to be dead, they had come back to Imcro to do what they might be done against the Ataskans. By now, of course, they had little enough hope, so they were embittered and angry, and it did not help their moods at all to find the daughter of the Itascan governor taking refuge with the same band of Makar as they had chosen. Since both she and they were guests, they could not follow their immediate inclinations and kill her, for they settled for acting as though she were not present at all. She could understand their actions and why they were acting thus. They did not know what she and Dalwyn had shared on their return trip to Imcro. That knowledge did not make their treatment of her much easier to bear. She settled for maintaining a polite and courteous demeanor, never seeming to notice their treatment of her. They seemed to take it as a sign of stupidity on her part, but she could not afford to take notice of that. And she knew in her own mind that a stupid person would not have been able to escape from her father's compound and make their way up into these mountains to find a place she'd only visited once for a short time. They were recruiting men and gathering weapons daily. They could not gather their recruits into one place, since such a gathering would very soon become known to Itascan agents, and Haltod would then have to send in troops. And no matter how unready Haltod was for confrontation, they were less ready. They would have one opportunity, one chance to raise a successful rebellion. If this first attempt failed, they would not have a chance to try another, for Haltod would occupy the land. He would garrison the larger cities and set up fortresses throughout the land, so that no person of Imcro could move without his knowing it. And beyond all this, they knew how difficult it would be to defeat the Itascan spearmen. So she did what she could, made herself useful among the women of the Makar, hoping eventually a sufficient number of them would come to recognize her as harmless. But she knew, underneath it all, that if word ever came that her troops were marching against the Makar, it was unlikely that even Lidasani could save her life. Suddenly a young Makar boy was at her elbow, saying in poor Haledanian, "Mistress, you come quick, Lidasani. He has a message he wished to discuss with you." "What sort of message?" The boy merely shrugged. Chief had given him a message and he delivered it. He knew nothing beyond that. She walked to the chieftain's hut, wondering just what this message might be. Could it be the feared message that her father had prepared troops to march? If that were the case, she'd better make ready to make some rational arguments for keeping her alive. When she came in the hut, Ludasani was there, along with Wallen. The Haledanian continued to act as though she were not there. "Lady, we have a message from Count Dalwyn." "A message? How? Where is he?" The Makar continued to regard her as though looking for some sign from her, some expression. Was he afraid she was a spy, and that news of Dalwyn might cause her to fear he would be coming to try and expose her? "The message comes through a talisman. One of the various tribes of the Makar have set up to pass news between themselves. It would appear that the Count was a prisoner of the Queosach and has managed to escape. He has made his way to one of the Makar settlements on the eastern plain, and they sent the message to us. Preparations are being made to send him straight here." "Is he well, then?" "Well enough, from what I hear. He ought to be arriving tonight." "Tonight? But if he is on the eastern plain, how could he manage to come so quickly?" Lidasani flashed a brief smile. "We Makar have a few tricks of our own. He'll be coming here this evening, and we'll talk more of it then." He dismissed her then, and she felt a little anger. That was it! He felt she was a spy, and he was giving her the opportunity to flee for the city of Imcro, taking word to her father that the Count was hidden among the Makar. She continued to prevent any trace of anger from showing on her face. It was not certain what the impending arrival of Dalwyn meant, but it certainly did not mean that she would flee, and she wondered just how Dalwyn might feel about her presence. Would he follow along with Wallen and his men and ignore her presence? She certainly hoped not, but whatever happened, she would live with that. Chapter 21. In the Makar territory, eastern plain of Haledania. He came out of his sleep snarling, lunging for the throat of the person who had been looming over him. His body refused to change, and even as he recognized the Makar leaning over him, he remembered. The first day and a half he had escaped from the Queosach had been relatively easy. In the afternoon of the second day, however, the hunt became earnest. It seemed nigh that every Queosach of an age to carry real weapons was after him. Men singly, men in large groups, men afoot and on horseback, men with dogs and hawks, men unaccompanied, were after him. With every wile at his disposal, he evaded the pursuit. He also used his wolf abilities to the utmost, every trick known to him to throw off the hunters. He knew what was happening. The king of the Queosach had been killed, and this hunt was to seek revenge. The leader whose men managed to slay the killer and bring him back would have a better chance of making himself king in his turn. He'd spent a good deal of time in wolf shape for the first day of the hunt, and the second day he changed a little less often, knowing the hazard of keeping the animal form for too long. He got little sleep, short naps taken here and there when it seemed he'd left the pursuit behind for a bit. The third day he'd been a little less careful of the shape change, concentrating on the task of eluding the hunt, though he knew at the back of his mind he was taking a risk. The days after that began to blur into confusion, running, hiding, twisting, turning, making his way ever westward. Too often, at the edge of complete fatigue, he had a choice between staying too long in wolf shape or being killed. Through the mountains he went. In theory, he was coming into Haladanian territory, and the pursuit ought to ease, but he knew full well that borders were loose hereabouts, and the pursuers would come as far as they thought they must. Indeed, it might well require a skirmish between one of the Haladanian lords and the Queosach to finally put an end to the chase. It was more difficult in the eastern plain of Haladania. With the wood becoming sparser and then ceasing altogether, there was a dearth of hiding places. He had managed to stay far enough ahead of the hunters that they never quite caught sight of him, but he knew very well what a dangerous position he was in. 2 days after he had reached the plain, the hunt ceased. He was still in his wolf shape, and he realized he heard nothing of the hunt for some time. He had paused, listened carefully. No, there was no sign of them. He thought he understood what had happened. Being the man to avenge a king was all well and good, but failing that, one would best be advised to have all your men with you when you made your attempt to take the kingship. He found it harder and harder to think as a man, even in his man shape. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that he had spent too much time in wolf shape and decided to stay in man shape unless absolutely necessary. He kept going on, knowing how far he had to go to get back to Imcro. He found himself, from time to time, suddenly shifted into mid-stride, without conscious thought. Such an instance required him to make special effort to change back again. When he lay down one night in human shape and woke up the next morning in human form, he did not worry too much. It happened every time, but when it happened every time when he fell asleep, it became a matter for concern. He began putting off sleeping until fatigue overwhelmed him. The result was that he would wake up as a wolf, wandering the plain, even occasionally headed back toward the forest. He tried twice to throw the talisman away. The first time he could not manage to force himself to do so. The second time he could have sworn he'd actually threw the talisman away, but a little while later he noticed it was still around his neck. Had he actually disposed of it and had made its own way back? Or had his mind convinced him that he had thrown it away when he actually had done nothing? He slept less well because of his concern for the talisman was taking over his will, which in turn made him less able to fight the change. He was sufficiently exhausted that he couldn't exactly make that connection or do anything about it. Suddenly there was a scent in the air, a somehow familiar scent. But was it? He thought he had almost remembered what it was, when he suddenly realized he'd once more slipped into wolf shape. A strong physical effort, he forced himself back into human shape and stopped. His weary mind refused to say why or how the scent was familiar, but there was no sense of threat behind it. As he stood there, the only thing that would come to his mind was that the scent had something of far-off Imcro in it. He moved to the direction the scent seemed to come from. He came around the corner of a hill. He suddenly realized he was at the edge of a Makar town. He stepped forward, and the inhabitants of the village began to notice him. As they noticed him, they began to reach for their weapons. He realized he had slipped into wolf shape again. He forced himself into human shape, and the effort overcame him. He stood there for a moment, and then fell into sleep. He woke from time to time. Something soothed him back to sleep again. He noticed he was waking up less and less often as a wolf. The talisman was still with him, and there seemed to be a succession of Makar watching over him. There was an old one, grizzled and lean, somewhat younger and a little heavier, and a female of middle age. His sleep was at first full of dreams of pursuit and struggle and fighting. The dreams began to come less and less often and he rested. He came fully awake and saw the old Makar above him. "Ludasani?" he asked, though he knew he could not possibly have traveled all the way to Imkro. The other shook his head. "No, we are far from where Ludasani lives, but we can speak to him if you wish." "Perhaps that would be best. I see I still manage to hold my human shape." Makar smiled slightly. "We had to use a talisman of our own to counter the effect of the talisman you wear. We know this talisman, you see. We knew if we took it from you now, you would sicken and die. We left it to do its work. If we left it to do its work, you would never change from wolf shape again. So we set up several talismans to counteract the pull to wolf shape and to give you rest. With luck, we may be able to carry you to the point where you can change back and forth at will again, but it will not be easy. There will come a time when we take our talismans away, and you must fight for it yourself. But rest now again, and we will talk later." He woke again, feeling refreshed and no longer so unutterably weary. The younger Makar was beside him and helped him to a sitting position. "How do you feel?" "Stiff," he replied. "Stiff in every joint and muscle." The Makar smiled. "Not too surprising, considering. If you will excuse me, Hadratsuan directed me to inform him as soon as you were awake. He walked to the door of the hut and called a child over, spoke to him rapidly, and came back." "How long have I been here?" The Makar held up a furry hand. "I can answer a few of your questions, but Hadratsuan wishes to speak to you more at length, and he will know more of the answers you wish. As for how long you've been here, it's been several days. I can tell you in general that you are cured, to the extent we can cure you. But Hadratsuan will have more to say to you about that. I must go as quickly as possible. I have to get back to Imkro." Makar made soothing motions. "Again, these are things that Hadratsuan will wish to talk to you about. Ah, and here he is." The old Makar came in the door. The messenger had only been sent a few moments before, but Hadratsuan was at the door, with no signs of having been hurried at all. He smiled. "A good day to you, Count Dalwin. It isn't good to see you looking so fit. And good day to you, Hadratsuan." Hadratsuan sat down beside Dalwin. "Now, you may have been told that you have been cured, so far as we were able to cure you. We were able to counteract the worst effects of the talisman, so that you need not fight quite so hard to keep from changing. Each day, each hour that you avoid changing will strengthen your ability to resist. I told you when you woke last we could not take the talisman away lest you sicken and die. At present you have some choices to make. You can cast aside the talisman yourself, for you are strong enough now to fight its effects, and while you might feel a little weakened for a few days, you are not likely to die. On the other hand, you can keep the talisman and avoid the use of it for as long as possible, until it has even less hold on you. There's a possibility that even now, changing once will start the process again, so that you will continue to crave it, and fighting against it may be even more difficult than it was this time." Hadratsuan paused. You need not make any decision at this moment. Perhaps not even for some days yet. I have talked with Ludasani, and he has some news you might wish to hear. The daughter of the Tuscan governor has taken refuge among his people. He is not sure what to do with her. For though it seems unlikely that the governor would use his daughter as a spy in such a circumstance, Ludusani cannot be certain. Also, your comrade, Wallen, has taken refuge with Ludusani and his people as well. They are making preparations to fight against the Atascans, but are hampered because too many do not wish to ride up to fight in your name without some sure word of your fate. I must be on my way again. Is there a horse in the village I might borrow? Hadratsuan smiled. We thought you would feel that way. Perhaps, if you are willing, we might find a way to send you to Imkro faster than by horse. Faster than a horse? How? You mean the fabled talisman of the Makar that can send people great distances in the blink of an eye? Rumor does the talisman great credit. We call it Way of Storms. And yes, it can send people great distances in very little time, but it has disadvantages of its own. A person traveling by the way arrives at his destination sick. No, not deathly ill, but disoriented, dizzy, and sick to the stomach. This all passes in half an hour to an hour, but is very wearing. If you really wish, you can send you by the way of the storms, but you will have to be careful. Such a trip may undo much of the good we've done you. Dalwyn sat up straighter. I must go. I will take the risk. The old Makar looked him over thoughtfully. After a long pause, he spoke. So be it. But if we are going to send you by the way, I will insist that you eat a little, then rest, preferably sleeping, until the time comes for you to leave. I will take your advice in this. If you took my advice, you would wait at least 3 days before you made the attempt. But I can see in your face you would wear yourself down and worry over 3 days, so that by the time you'd be in no better condition than you are now. I will send someone with food in a few moments. Thank you. If you will allow it, I will walk a bit before the food comes. My joints need loosening. Certainly. You would be better for a bit of gentle exercise, but don't try too much. He needn't have given that last warning. Dalwyn found a few steps out in the sun and back was more than enough for him. Shortly after, a Makar woman appeared bearing a bowl of creamy soup. He looked at them and began to eat. It occurred to him as he began that he was hungry. Hadratsuan returned as he was eating. Dalwyn looked up at him. Soup, Hadratsuan? The other smiled. When you have traveled the way of the storms this evening, you will be happy to have no more than soup in your stomach. Probably the only thing worse is to have nothing at all in your stomach. When he had finished, Dalwyn lay down again. He doubted if he would be able to sleep, but he closed his eyes for a moment. His dreams were full of Kwiosach pursuing him, Kwiosach stalking him, Kwiosach attacking him, and then someone shaking him awake, and he was coming up out of sleep snarling. It was Hadratsuan, and it was time for him to go. The talisman that controlled the Way of Storms was a large one, consisting of a stone that had been polished to a finish that almost shone. On the stone was carved a strange pattern, a spiral that caught the eyes and drew them into the center. Remember what I said. This is a hard thing, something that our people do only at the gravest necessity. You will suffer for it for a while, but you must not let yourself think that the suffering is because of your own weakness. Are you ready? Yes. Look at the stone. Let your eyes follow the spiral. As Dalwyn followed the instructions, Hadratsuan spoke a word. There was an instant of intense pain, followed by a time of no sensation at all. There was no up, no down, nothing under his feet. Vertigo struck, suddenly as though everything was spinning. Sensation returned in a brief burst of pain, but the vertigo was still with him. Nausea overcame him. There was something under his feet now, but he couldn't stand. He fell helplessly to his right, retching violently. He remembered Hadratsuan's comment that he would be happy to have no more than soup in his stomach. Light flared around him, and suddenly consciousness fled. Okay, so like I said, I'm only going to do 5 chapters tonight, and then tomorrow I'll do 6. So, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate having patience with me for my late start tonight. I will talk to you all again tomorrow evening. So, have a good night.